My name is Charles Nugent, and I, along with Tracy in the back there, will serve as your moderators. Together, we'll be moderating the room, the virtual chat, and handling any issues that arise. If time permits, at the conclusion of the presentation, there will be a Q&A period. In-person attendees, please raise your hands and we'll bring the microphone to you. Wait till we get there with the microphone so that the online folks will be able to hear your questions, please. And that way, we'll bring the microphone to you as a recording session. We want to make sure clearly understood for everybody. If you're live streaming, we encourage you to submit your written questions anytime during the presentation using the Zoom chat option. If we do not have enough time for your questions, the presenter's contact information will be displayed at the end of the session. All virtual attendees will be able to be in listen-only mode for the duration of today's session. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulty at any time during this period, please submit your technical issue to the Q&A panel and our virtual moderator will assist you. If you receive an electric survey at the end of each session, please fill it out so we can better serve your needs in future forums. Counselors receiving CRC and CEU credits, please go to the table in the pre-function area to have your sign-in attendance sheet stamped at the end of the session. With that, please make sure your phones are silenced, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. I'd like to introduce you to your presenters. And we have Lutz, the economist, and Gabriel Guzman, the manager of LMI Dissemination and Outreach for Texas Workforce Commission.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me on the microphone? Okay, it's really good to be here. My name is Lutz. I'm one of our economists here. Obviously, this is my supervisor, Mike Guzman. And we're going to talk today, when I was at the workforce conference last fall, a lot of boards were talking about their interest in sectors of the economy. They weren't just looking at one industry, they were looking at a sector of the economy and saying, how can we serve this part of the economy? Because there seemed to be, recognition that some of these industries work together. And so we came back in our office and said, how can we help people find data that might help them make good choices relating to understanding different sectors of the economy? Because obviously, to help businesses and job seekers, we need to understand the world that we're operating in. So that was the genesis of today's presentation. I'm going to do a brief introduction, then I'm going to turn over to Mike, who's going to talk about the current economy. And then I'm going to come back later on in the presentation and talk about some of the data sources we have that people can use to understand different sectors of the economy. So I'm going to start off with a quote from Michael Porter, who's was a professor at Harvard University. And, Porter is someone who's done a lot of research into clusters, economic clusters. Some of you have heard of economic cluster theory. Professor Porter has a lot to do with, is a leading thinker in that area. And one comment he made in a paper is the role of locations has long been overlooked, despite striking evidence that innovation and competitive access in so many fields are geographically concentrated. So sometimes sometimes one industry will thrive because of the presence of related industries in an area, whether it's suppliers or people that might purchase an industry's products. And so when we understand clusters of the economy and how they relate to each other, it gives us a better understanding of why some industries are more prevalent in some areas than in others, and how we can serve those industries and their labor and employment needs. So the next thing we're going to do, just as a general rule, we're going to, as I mentioned, we're going to start with a general overview of the regional economy, including look at what COVID has done on the performance of key economic sectors. And then we're going to talk at the conclusion of the presentation on different data sources and their advantages and limitations for discussing sector-based data. And what we hope is that this is this helps provide more tools that people in the workforce system can use to better serve all of our customers. I think the thing, when we're looking at sector trends, I would note that sector-based strategies in the workforce system involve both data and policy. Obviously, we're more the data people. We can tell you about information, labor market information that helps understand the economy better. but it's also policy driven. You know, for example, Alamo has really moved a lot in this direction. And in addition to looking at data on the different sectors that are prevalent in the San Antonio area, if you walk into one of their workforce centers, you're going to see posters on the wall. You're going to see a lot of visual representations of sectors that are growing in that region. So they focus not just on the labor market data, but also on how do we organize our workforce system to assist the industries and sectors that our local business leadership has told us are critical to our economy. And the other thing, and I know most of you who've been in the workforce system a while totally understand this reality, but I think it's worth repeating. One size does not fit all. What might work in Austin might be a bad fit in another part of the state, and vice versa. We allow each workforce board to come up with its own local priorities because every community in Texas is different. That's not a normative statement. That's just a statement of reality, that every part of our state has a role to play, and every part of our state is different, and our workforce system is designed to reflect that. So that's why we tried to make this presentation such that every region of the state would find value in it. So I hope that this is an informative look at how you can learn more about the economy. And with that, for an economic overview of current trends in the economy, I will turn it over to my supervisor, Mike Guzman.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mike Guzman, Manager of Dissemination and Outreach. And as Will said, I will give a short overview of the Texas and regional economy. First slide here we have is the unemployment rate for Texas, graphed over the 4 previous business cycles. The areas shaded in gray are those recessions that hit. I basically displayed it this way to kind of give perspective as far as like to the COVID pandemic. The chart stands all the way to the left. It starts with the 1990s recession. And as you can tell, the very stark spike that happened all the way to the right, the COVID impact on the unemployment rate was not necessarily unforeseen by most experts at the beginning of this, who foresaw a large, sharp increase in the unemployment rate, lots of job loss, followed by a quick recovery. So that basically is bearing out the graph there as what you've seen. It rose a lot and reached a high of 12.6% unemployment rate in April, but has since fallen sharply. Over the month, the Texas unemployment rate dropped to 4.3%. And I'm sorry, I'll just say right here, this presentation was actually submitted with March data. We just released April data last week. So I'll be commenting the stuff you'll be hearing me say will be April data. So they may not match what you see on the chart, but so the Texas unemployment rate dropped to 4.3% in April and improved or stayed the same. That is the unemployment rate over the month for 24 consecutive months for 2 years. So it hasn't, ever since that spike of 12.6%, it's either gone down or stayed the same. Currently, the Texas rate stands 0.7 percentage point higher than the US. The US rate is the line in blue, where Texas is in red, of which the US rate stayed the same over the month at 3.6%. So that's the April rate. The Texas rate is at its lowest point since February 2020, which is what we consider the pre-pandemic starting point with a reading of 3.5%. Just to give more context about like the drastic change that happened during COVID, the 4-week rolling average for initial claims, that is those who file a claim because they have jobless, they lost their job and they wish to receive unemployment benefits. That rose almost 1,200% over the month from February, from a level of 12,000 to 155,400 the next month. So definitely a very stark change there. Continued claims, which are claims have been verified by the state and the workers are receiving benefits, reached a peak of 1.3 million claims for 2 consecutive months in June and July 2020 and remained elevated there for a few months thereafter. The unemployed doubled over the month in March from 700,000 to 1.7 million in April. And although some indicators like job count, labor force, and employment have surpassed pre-COVID levels, as you can tell on the chart there, the unemployment rate has yet to catch up to pre-pandemic levels. we are currently 0.9 of a point below the February mark of 3.4%. So 26 months into this, we still haven't reached where we started. But as you can tell by the drastic V shape, it is going a lot quicker than previously. In contrast, the 1990s recession took 54 months, it's 4.5 years to return to a pre-recession trough of 6.2%. After that, the dot-com bubble, if you remember in the early 2000s, 9/11, that recession actually never reached a pre-recession trough of 4.1% before heading into the Great Recession. So it never actually met that 4.1%. The Great Recession, that largest gray shaded area there, took 111 months to return to a trough of 4.3%. That happened in June 2017. And so that, as you can tell, that this one is a lot, it doesn't act like your typical normal recession. I think if you all were able to see Chair Daniels yesterday speak on this, I think he summed it up perfectly. It represents more of a natural disaster than a typical recession. The civilian labor force continues to grow in Texas. The civilian labor force, for those who don't know, is basically, it is a measure of those Texas citizens that are age 16 and over and non-institutionalized, that is not in prison or institution like that. Those that are working and also or looking for work. So the Texas civilian labor force increased by 126,100 people for this year alone in 2022. Since the pandemic, we've added over 510,000 citizens or workers or persons, I'm sorry, to the civilian labor force. The fastest growing MSAs are still the same on the chart there, even though that's last month's data. Austin led with a 4.9% now updated annual growth rate. DFW and Waco were the next two. So the chart in the map that you're seeing there, the ones in blue are the ones that actually added, and the ones in the brown shade are lost civilian labor force. So in April, there was actually 5 that lost, small decreases. Beaumont is still on that list of minus 0.9%, followed by El Paso and San Angelo, each at 0.4%, and Wichita Falls and Corpus Christi, a really small amount at 0.3 and 0.2%. Part of that reason is Texas is a growing state. This is Census Bureau data. It looks at from 2020 to 2021. The states in blue represent those that actually added population, while those in the brown shade lost. Texas had the largest populations of all 50 states, with an increase of 310,000 new residents over the year. Florida and Arizona came in next with increases of 211,000 and 98,000 respectively. On the flip side of that, the largest population decreases happened in New York, minus 319,000 residences. They've actually lost more than we gained. California lost 262,000 in population, whereas Illinois lost 114,000. Overall, 33 states increased in population, while 17 had population declines. This chart is looking at job growth. As you can see here, going back to the Great Recession and COVID, going into the COVID pandemic, Texas enjoyed a long streak of employment growth. Before COVID, year over year, employment grew 119 consecutive months. That's that long streak there. As of today, April, total non-farm reached an employment high for the 6th consecutive month, with just under 13.3 million jobs in April as far as the actual level. Jobs increased by 62,800 over the month, and it was actually double what you see there in March. So that is growing. To date, the state added 318,300 jobs since COVID. And over the month, the private sector, that is non-government, gained 57,600 jobs, while all 11 major industries added jobs. Over the year, employment grew by 742,000 jobs. Texas is in full swing. This looks at the Texas recovery versus the top 10 largest states by employment. To date, there's only been 4 of these states, 4 out of 10, that have actually recovered their full pre-pandemic employment. Texas at this point has added about 1.8 million jobs from April 2020 to April 2022, about 2 years. After shedding 1.5 million from February to April. So if you look at the data, the largest employment loss occurred in those 2 months right after February. So March and April is when the large drop happened, and we started immediately to gain jobs back. The US in comparison lost about 20.8 million jobs and gained back about just under 22 after shedding 22 million. So the US has not come back as a whole versus Texas has. This chart actually shows Texas at the second place. As of April, actually Texas ranked first in terms of COVID recovery at 102.5%, having regained employment. Texas ranked 4th overall, all states, including Washington, DC in terms of recovery. Utah, Idaho, and Montana, smaller states, had a greater rate of recovery. And lastly, Texas ranked 6th in terms of private jobs recovery. I just wanted to also point out that Texas regained all its jobs back in November 2021. Those dates there were actually 1 month behind the North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, the other 3 states that had regained employment back. This is a look at major industries growing over the year. We can actually add one more industry to that. Education and health services regained all its employment back in April. Of the 11 major industries, professional and business services, trade, transportation, utilities, and financial activities all passed their employment level back in March. Professional and business services, which includes things like architectural services, engineering, things like that, added 154,900 jobs and stands at 108.4% of recovery. Trade, transportation, and utilities was next at 105.8%, which added 145,500 jobs. This includes retail trade, wholesale trade, things like truck transportation and warehousing services, things like that. A lot of that, due to the shift towards online shopping and things like that, that helped that industry recover a lot there. Financial activities gained 108.4% and gained 69,000 jobs, while information surpassed its pre-COVID level employment peak in September 2021 and added 11,400 jobs. It stands at 105.4%. This is actually not IT, as you would think. It's more like newspapers, television, things like that. And then, of course, the new one that happened this month was education health services, gained 11,300 jobs beyond its peak. We'll look at the major metros in the area, the 5 largest metros. Austin continues to lead job growth, having in the expansion phase. Austin increased for the 14th consecutive month, a monthly increase of about 7,000 jobs in April. It performed all other areas and stands at 107.8% of pre-pandemic levels. It was actually second in terms of annual growth rate at 7.4. Dallas, Plano, Irving, which is the other half of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, added about 22,100 jobs over the month, and basically added the most jobs over the month and the most post-COVID. It added 170,200 jobs post-COVID and stands at 106.2%. We're happy to report also that this month, the Houston MSA actually surpassed its pre-COVID level this month. That was one of the areas that had been lagging behind, mostly due to a lot of oil and gas related industries have a larger concentration in that area. That one stands at 100%, with just 300 jobs over pre-COVID levels. Overall, 15 of 26 MSAs had regained pre-COVID employment. Just to name those off real quick, that includes Waco, Brownsville, Sherman, McAllen, Lubbock, Killeen, Amarillo, Tyler, College Station, and Abilene. So over half of the MSAs have regained those employment levels. You may have heard stories of employers having a hard time, filling in positions. One of the things that this does is it places upward pressure on wages as employers try to coax workers back into the labor force or take positions. Here we have average hourly earnings for total private workers, good producing as private service providing. Texas private average hourly earnings increased 6.2% over the year and outpaced the U.S. gains by 0.7 percentage points. Over the month, Texas AHE increased by 29 cents an hour to a level of 29.67 in April. Over the year since April 2021, private average hourly earnings increased $1.73 an hour with a monthly average of about 29.14 over those 12 months. Private service providing is the large takeaway here, which would include professional type services like engineering and software development, but also leisure and hospitality, fast food workers, things like that. That gained the most, as you can tell, from 2021 to 2022. It gained about $2.04 or 7.4%. Just anecdotally on the way over here, I passed by Bill Miller Barbecue, and they had a sign there that they were offering $15 an hour starting. So trying to fill those positions. So that made a huge increase in that industry. And lastly, goods producing increased by 1.6%. Not as much as the others. So we don't actually have a way to measure on a monthly basis rural areas. So we pulled some quarterly census of employment and wage data. This is actually a different program. It allows for more granular data down to the county level and more granular industries. But so with this particular chart here, it looks at the rural counties or as non-MSA counties to kind of give perspective on how recovery is behaving versus metropolitan statistical areas. One thing about QCW data is since it's all encompassing and basically covers over 95% of employment in Texas, it is backwards. It's not as current as the CS monthly data. So from this particular perspective, the most current we had was third quarter 2021. So these comparisons are from pre-COVID 2019 to 2021. With that being said, information in third quarter of 21 had increased 0.3%. Professional business services had met its or surpassed its pre-COVID level at 1.5% with 821 jobs. And the government had also expanded at 0.9% with just under 2,000 jobs added. So 3 industries had recovered by that time. In comparison, urban counties, which includes those MSA areas, a lot more recovery. Recovery was a lot more, concentrated in those areas. Trade, transportation, and utilities had expanded by this time by 2.5% versus a contraction of 0.2% in rural areas. This accounted for 56,000 jobs in the MSA areas. Financial activities also recovered about 21,000 jobs and gained about 2.9% versus a contraction of 4% in rural areas. Professional business services, one of the strongest gainers in CS data, also expanded by 5.1% and outpaced rural, which expanded also, but at 1.5%. Education health services also exceeded in urban counties, but represented a contraction of 4.5% in rural counties. A lot of the recovery is happening more so in the urban areas. Look at job ads. As you probably know, job ads are at really historic highs and continue to be elevated. This is taking Help Wanted Online. It's a third-party source that looks at major job boards. They created an index that follows the job count. It increased 8.3 points over the month and 68, almost 70 points over the year from a year ago levels. Texas Help Wanted job ads increased 10.3% over the month and 30.3% over the year with more than 700,000 postings in March. So 711,822 specifically. The job ads peaked recently or in December of 2021 at 786,000 jobs. So before the pandemic, all the way back to January 2015, the average job level was about 329,000. So that's double of what it was before the pandemic. Yes. Mhm. Yes, this is Texas. I'm sorry. Going along the same topic, looking at middle skilled jobs. For those that don't know, middle skilled jobs are what are categorized as any job requiring more than a high school degree, but less than 2 year, with a few exceptions. Registered nurse, you may also have a bachelor's of 4 years and do that also. So overall, middle skilled jobs follow the same trend as the total jobs overall. The chart on the left there is the the 5 most demanded jobs in middle skills. At the top of the list is registered nurses. This really hadn't changed. Customer service representatives, truck drivers, and repair workers from pre-pandemic levels. Kind of goes back to the chart about us having, pre-COVID expanding month over month. COVID happened. We're just kind of keep on trucking, going on the same path. So some of the same occupations still being needed. General medical and surgical hospitals are the top industries seeking applicants for both RNs and customer service representatives. CSR is made up of 48.1% over the last 2 months, increased 48% from 16,000 to 24,000. So an increase in those in March. So middle skilled jobs made up just under 300,000 and represented about 41.6% of all jobs posted. So look at claims, just kind of taking it back to claims. Definitely you can see the increase there with COVID happened in March. The 4-week rolling average for initial claims actually decreased 80% over the year. So we're back down to where we were or past where we started, and continued claims decreased about 70% over the year. The March 22 4-week rolling average for continued claims was about 34,500 below the February pre-pandemic level. So we're below where we started. Some other evidence looking at this, the layoffs are at an all-time low too. There's a survey by BLS called the JOLTS, the Job Openings Labor Turnover Survey. Basically says that the Texas JOLT have sustained low layoff rates of less than 1% since March 2021, reaching the lowest value in the series back to October, in October 2021. Basically, if employers, with such a tight labor market, if they're having employees, are doing everything they can to keep them. And despite the fact that the Texas economy has diversified so much from oil and gas, from the 80s, we do like to track, West Texas intermediate crude prices and rig counts. In March, West Texas intermediate spot price averaged $108.50 over the month, as that has increased. You have to go back all the way to July 2014, where the spot price was above $100. So it had been depressed for a while, but current events going on, and COVID, economies being reopened, and increased pent-up demand all put a pressure on the need for oil and gas. Texas added 116 rigs over the year and 17 rigs over the month. It brought the rig count to 319, which was the highest count since March 2020. There is evidence in April this year, there's 118 drilling permits that have been approved by Texas. So they're planning to get the rig count online. As you can tell, before March 20, the rig count has kind of lagged behind the price. We've been told that getting the right staffing shortages might have a reason to do that. Also with the volatility, the drillers like to have a little bit more certainty before they invest in those rigs. But so that's why the separation between the two seems to be happening at that point. This is looking at the consumer price index versus the average hourly earnings. BLS is the one that computes the consumer price index, and they do it for the two largest MSAs in Texas, the Dallas-Fort Worth, Arlington, and the Houston MSA. So this is the most current one as of March, the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington area. In March, Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, average hourly earnings actually increased 7.1% over the year, while the consumer price index increased 9% over the year. So unfortunately here, CPI increased faster than earnings did. However, the DFW consumer price index remains below the US as a whole. The Dallas-Fort Worth CPI is 269, a value of 269 versus the US value of 287.5. So overall, still cheaper things than the US as a whole, but inflation is catching up. So the area of AHE increased over the month, average hourly earnings for 28 consecutive months in Dallas, beginning back in 2019, while the CPI has increased each period beginning July 2020, so at a later date. Dallas energy prices were the main reason for that jump, having increased 37.4% in the last 12 months, while food increased 9.8%. Part of that equation that goes into CPI is housing prices, also affected by increased population and job growth. This is a look at the 5 largest MSAs and how their median price has performed over the years back to 2015. The Austin MSA has the highest median price at just over 521,100 jobs. It really began to separate itself from the other MSAs going back to March 21. The Texas median home price increased 53,000 over the year in March and 87,000 over a 2-year period ending March 2022. So both Austin and the Dallas-Plano Irving Metropolitan Division increased 22.6% year over year in March. So the Austin MSA home price increased 96,000 over the year and 191,100 over the 2-year period. And since 2021 started to separate itself from the other areas. So that kind of concludes the brief overview of the economy. Just to kind of sum things up, the Texas seasonally adjusted unemployment rate dropped to 4.3%, continues to improve. Over the year, Texas added 742,000 total non-farm jobs. This is April numbers, what you're seeing is March again. Texas employers have added 1.76 jobs from April 2020 to March. So from the peak of the pandemic, the effect of the pandemic to now. Job demand increased over the month as told by the job openings data, and March continued claims continue to remain below the pre-COVID level. Concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mike. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to talk about finding sector data. So you're looking at your economy and you see a lot of interrelated industries. How do we find data that tell us where is the competitive advantage and how can we learn more about industries we'd like to focus on? And that's what I'm going to talk about in the time we have remaining. Thing I think to do if you were looking at a sector-based strategy in the workforce world is first identify your key sector NAICS codes. Most of you know that we have to classify industries so we can collect data on them. We need a common denominator, and that for us, that's NAICS codes. Most of you probably filled them out in forms you fill out and in other places. And one thing to be aware of is sometimes the way that NAICS codes are set up, a related industry might be in different super sectors. I have one presentation I give in Austin a couple times where I talk about what is tech. And I actually talk about some of the industries where tech lives in, and it actually shows up in different NAICS sectors where the first digit of the NAICS code will be different. Remember that when you're dealing with NAICS, it's what's called a hierarchical structure, which means that a 6-digit NAICS code, think of a microscope you use in high school biology class. The really long lens on the microscope gives you the very detailed view of the slide in biology, and the less long lens gives you a much broader view. You can probably see the whole slide. A 6-digit NAICS code is like that really long lens in high school biology. And the really short lens might be a 2-digit NAICS code. The number of digits tells you how detailed the industry is. We can look at, after you've kind of identified what your NAICS codes are that you're interested in, then look at the occupations that those NAICS codes hire. So if you're interested in computer manufacturing, what occupations would a computer manufacturing firm hire, for example? And then just remember that wages and projections, I mean, you're going to want to make sure that if you're spending a lot of resources targeting something, that it's going to pay enough for people to make a living. The occupations that the industry hires commonly pay enough so that people can live on it. And also you want to look a little bit at projections, because projections are going to tell you, is it an expanding industry or is it a contracting industry? Because obviously, if you're going to be encouraging people to look at different career and industry options, you want to propose things to them where there's likely to be increasing demand for it in your region. So with that, let's talk about some examples here. And one of the sectors that Alamo focused on was construction, architecture, and utilities. So they wanted to put that in their local plan. This is taken from their 21 to 24 local plan for workforce solutions, Alamo. And they identified 4-digit NAICS codes that related to construction, architecture, and utilities: highway, street, and bridge construction, utility system construction, architectural engineering and related services, and building material and supplies dealers. Notice that the last two of those had a different NAICS code from the first two in terms of the first digit. They're in completely different sectors, but they're also a little bit related. I mean, when you think about it, architects make plans to build stuff. People in construction also build things. So if you're going to build something, you're going to need construction companies to build it. You're also going to need architects to design it. And when you get it open, you're going to need utilities, because anybody who's been through a summer here knows you're going to want air conditioning in whatever building you want to build. So while these industries are distinct and they're in different super sectors, they're also related. And so they put those NAICS codes in their local plans and said, this is a sector we want to emphasize because this is a sector that's important to our region. And to give another example, I just threw out tech. And from my tech presentation, an example of 4 industries that you see a lot of tech in would be computer and electronic manufacturing. You see some in information. You see telecommunications. I mean, if you want a lot of the broadband and internet service is provided by telecommunications providers. So 517 would be, in my view, a tech NAICS code. There is no standard definition of tech, by the way. I did a lot of time doing research on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and other sources to see if there was a standard definition of tech. There really isn't. And then that professional, scientific, and technical services also has a lot of tech employment in it. So if you are focusing on technology, you might want to look at those NAICS codes and see what occupations do those industries hire. What does the pay scale in those occupations look like? Because that can help you understand the sector better, which would also help you look at what the career opportunities are that might be worth promoting. So let me give you some sources where you can find some data that help us understand sectors of the economy. The first one, all of these were mentioned. A lot of these have been mentioned in Mike's presentation. And I'll go into more detail. The current employment statistics, or CES, is monthly job counts by industry. It's based on survey data, but the advantage of it is it comes out every month. Quarterly census of employment and wages, also Mike mentioned that. That comes off your tax records, and we get that every quarter. We're also going to talk about a couple of data points that you don't often see in our presentations. We're going to talk about industry restricted OEWS occupational data. We're going to talk about something called staffing patterns, which we also refer to as an input-output matrix. And we're going to talk about some other data products we offer, which include Texas labor analysis. Now let's start with CES. A lot of times I start with CES because it's the most recent, but CES gives you a very top-level overview. I mean, the industries, especially in smaller metro areas, in CES are very general, but the real advantage of CES is it comes out every month. You know exactly when it's going to come out because we have a release schedule posted to texaslmi.com. Friday, usually in the middle of the month at 9 a.m., we update CES. The only exception to that's February, where we don't have any release days for CES. We have 2 of them in March. It is a time series. Time series is economists speak for you could validly compare February of 20 to April of 2022. Time series means that the series is designed to be continuous and you can compare different months on that survey. It's an apples to apples comparison. In fact, we have seasonal adjusted data for CES at the highest level and for some of the statewide industries. San Antonio has, and Houston is another one that has a little bit more detail in CES than in some other areas. And some of our smaller metros, CES is a little general. Again, limitations of CES is the industries are very general. It'll cover part of targeted clusters. So remember when I gave my 2 cluster examples earlier, or my 2 sector examples, a lot of them were in different super sectors. A lot of them had different first digit of the NAICS code. CES is not going to dig into the 4-digit level for you in metropolitan areas generally. There are exceptions, but in general, it doesn't get that detailed. The other limitation of CES, obviously, is we're talking about industry data, what the company does, rather than occupational data, what the person does. But remember, it takes a company to hire a person. So you have to understand what's going on in somebody's industry before you can understand what they might be hiring for. So both matter, but both have, but just be aware you're not dealing with occupations in CES. So probably the easiest way, but CES will give you the general lay of the land. What is the big picture in this region? But probably the best way to give yourself that kind of high level overview would be to go to our website, texaslmi.com. And the screenshot you see, let me advance my slideshow here. The popular downloads, we've put some spreadsheets together to take the work out of it for you. So if you go to the popular downloads and you click on CES, we have our CES spreadsheets organized by the city name. And the reason for that is, while people who work in the workforce system might know the names of our workforce boards, a lot of people in the general public might not. So I know that North Texas is a reference to Wichita Falls, but perhaps a college professor who works in Oklahoma that might be interested in our data might not know the names of our workforce boards. And so that's why we try to organize these things under city names or metropolitan area names when we can. So if you're looking for Alamo, you'd look at San Antonio, New Braunfels, CES, for example. Capital area, you'd look for Austin, Round Rock. CES only lives in the metropolitan areas. CES only provides statewide and metro area data. It does not provide non-metropolitan county data. So that would be downloading that spreadsheet for your region, I think is a good place to start, just to give you an idea of what the industry mix in a community is and how that's changed over the near term. Alamo, just to give an example, they came up with several sectors they wanted to focus in, like aerospace, construction, cybersecurity, education, healthcare, IT, manufacturing, oil and gas, and warehousing and transportation. So I gave this presentation once in San Antonio, and I went and looked up CES series, which are their industry names, which cover a portion of their targeted sectors. It's not a perfect fit like a QCEW would be, where you can really pinpoint the industries, but at least gives them a kind of big picture of what's going on. So some other keynotes. One thing about CES, it's also a little bit of limitation. CES classifies any service that's provided by government under government. So if it's an ISD, an independent school district, that's going to get classified in CES under government. A public hospital would get classified under government, whereas QCEW will put it under healthcare or education. So sometimes when I look at the industry mix in a community, even though QCEW comes out later, I'll use QCEW data. And that is especially true in communities where healthcare, of course, just about every community, healthcare and education is a big deal, but it's more of a big deal in some communities than it's big deal everywhere, but it's a really big deal in some areas. In those areas, I tend to use QCEW simply because of how they classify healthcare and education. And again, CES can just give you the big picture, but to get to a sector-based vision of the economy, you're going to need to go one step further. You're going to need to dive a little deeper, and that's where QCEW can come in. QCEW can give you very detailed industries. QCEW will give you 6-digit industries if you want them. For QCEW, you will need to go to LMI by category and texaslmi.com, which is our main data website. And you could select an industry level and get everything at that industry level, or you can dig in and using your cursor, you can select any industry you're interested in, including going all the way down to the 6-digit level. And so all of that data is public, and it's updated. As soon as the update is publicly released, we post it to the site. And so that's where you can get QCEW data. Sample output you're going to see from QCEW, you'll have the industry name, the level of the industry, the number of establishments and firms. The firm is the company, but a firm can have more than one work site. So an establishment would be a work site. In general, establishments is going to be greater than the number of firms. So one firm can have more than one establishment, but every firm has at least one establishment. So you're always going to have a greater number of establishments than firms, because every establishment is associated with the firm. You'll have average employment, which is the average of 3 months of employment. Again, this is pulled from tax records and supplemented by surveys from employers. We have an average weekly wage, which is basically total earnings, the total unemployment taxable earnings divided by, or total earnings, excuse me, let me just be careful, total earnings divided by the number of weeks in the quarter. We also put total wages, and we break the employment down by month if you want to go there. So that's what QCEW provides. QCEW's advantages is you get a lot of detailed industries, and you get some wage information. Again, average weekly wage, it includes things like bonuses and overtime in QCEW. So it's not a wage rate. It's a time normalized earnings estimate, basically. But it gives you that level of detail. The limitations is it takes us a while, because the employers have got to file their tax returns, and then we have to follow up with the employer to apportion the particularly multi-work site employers to apportion it to the correct county. Also, we do not seasonally adjust QCEW data. So, you have a lot of retail in the fourth quarter, for example. QCEW is not seasonally adjusted. Now let me talk a little bit about our main source of occupational data, which is the Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics Survey, or OEWS. Occupational wage data can exist by industries. In other words, when somebody files for taxes, they have to tell us what industry they're in. They have to tell us how many people they're employing, what they're paying them. They don't have to tell us what those people do. So we have to follow up with a survey to ask them what they do. However, when we do that survey, well, we know what industry the survey business is in. So if we call up an auto shop and say, can you give us the names and job titles of your workers? We know what it's an auto shop that's giving us that information. So we can actually take that occupational data and look at what industries are hiring in that occupation. One thing though about statistics is, for statistical reliability purposes, I like to say statisticians like big numbers. The larger your numbers are for statistics, the more likely you are to get reliable reported data. So you're more likely to see industry restricted OEWS surveys data available statewide and in your larger metro areas than in your smaller metro areas. The other thing you need to ask yourself, with some occupations, it pretty much pays the same or very similar wages, regardless of who the employer is. In some other occupations, if you practice this occupation in one industry, you wind up getting paid a lot more than if you practice it in another industry. So in some industries, restricting our occupational wage data by industry could be very useful. It could tell you something about the economy. In some areas, it's not going to tell you that much, and you're probably better off just doing the all industries number, which I recommend unless you have a reason for doing otherwise. But you're better off with the all industries number because it doesn't really add a whole lot of value to break it out by industry. Sometimes you just have to look at the data to see. But there are some occupations where there is a pay differential between industries. Let me also talk about something we call suppression. There is a federal law that governs all of our data. There are also some state laws that come into play that say, if you can tell the identity of an individual person or an individual business by the data that we release, we can't release it. That's called suppression. So the reason we do that is, frankly, some of the information we deal with is commercially sensitive. I mean, would a business want its competitors knowing how many people they employ at a certain plant or a certain facility? Probably not. So the only way we are able to get the business community to voluntarily cooperate with us and give us data is to promise them that we're not going to release it in identifiable form. We need to have enough people in there where it's an average or an aggregate. So if it's too small, if there are too few people in an area or an industry, we're going to have to suppress it by federal law. And there's nothing that TWC can do about that, by the way. That's federal law, but it exists for a very well thought out reason. Suppression is a big risk when you're dealing with industry restricted OEWS, especially in your smaller areas. Basically, the thinner you slice your search parameters, the more narrow you go, the longer the microscope lens you use, the more likely you are you don't see anything at all and you run into suppression. So it's just be aware of that. So here's how you can do. Our spreadsheets for OEWS only deal with the all industry number because 9 times out of 10, that's the better number. However, if you go on to texaslmi.com and you go to LMI by category and you select OEWS wage data, it will allow you to select industries after you've selected an occupation. So if you select occupation, you can select individual industries under that occupation. The one I have on the slide is accountants and auditors because I happen to know that accountants are hired in a lot of different industries. And it starts with A, so it was easy to find in an alphabetized list. You could pick out individual industries you're interested in the industry restricted data, or you could do, like we have industry levels, like you could do all 2-digit NAICS codes, and it would call that up for you. Our site can do either. And if you are interested in diving deeper into that, you can contact us and we can walk you through a little bit how to do it. But we also have help videos online on texaslmi.com that help you with that. So I'll give you a sample here. I just did Alamo and I said accountants. And the reason I used accountants as my example is because I happen to know that accountants work in a whole lot of professions. I mean, when I use the word, a whole lot of industries. When I use the word accountant with people in this room, you probably are thinking of the big 4 accounting firms. Or you might think of the small business that does people's taxes around April 15th. The truth is accountants work in all kinds of different industries. Most big companies have multiple accountants on staff. So if you look in Alamo, we estimate that there are 8,450 accountants and they make a mean wage of $74,026 a year in our 2020 OEWS data. But if you notice, they work in a wide variety of industries. Computer systems design, we've got 110 of them there. Management, scientific and technical consulting, we have 250 people working there. Elementary and secondary schools, we have 100 of them working there. General medical and surgical hospitals have 80 accountants on staff. And notice too, that you have quite a differential in wages. I mean, you have elementary and secondary schools, accountants who work in the elementary and secondary schools industry average $63,922 in pay. If they work for medical and diagnostic laboratories, it's over $80,000 a year. So there is a significant pay differential for accountants depending on what industry you work in. So the other thing we have, in addition to restricting occupational wage data by industry, you can look at staffing patterns. And staffing patterns are a project of our projection program that's based on the OEWS survey. We call it the IO matrix because what it does is it allows you to go from industry to occupation or vice versa. So a staffing pattern will say, what occupations are hired by this industry? Or what industries hire this occupation? So if you have some industries you're interested in and you want to see what occupations they hire, a staffing pattern can tell you that. So you can find our staffing patterns. The way you do it is you go to popular downloads. It's organized by workforce development area. So in this case, I highlighted Alamo WDA industry occupation matrix. We have one of these for all 28 workforce boards. So you can find data that is specific to your region. Now, the level of detail that we have in staffing patterns is going to depend on the size of your region. It's, as I said, statisticians like big numbers. Key steps, what you'll want to do if you want to look at what occupations are hired in the sector of the economy, the first thing you'll do, and our spreadsheets come pre-filtered for you, so you don't even have to apply the filter. You would filter out the industry that you're interested in. So you'd filter for your industry of interest. Also remember that just like NAICS codes have like a 2-digit NAICS code and a 4-digit NAICS code and a 6-digit NAICS code, you have something similar with SOC codes, standard occupational classifications for occupations. So I encourage, if you wanted to see what occupations are hired, what occupations are hired by this, does this industry hire? I would eliminate the major or minor categories because those are roll-ups of multiple occupations. That way you're not double counting things. Like if you're sorting from largest to smallest, you're not double counting. And then you would sort by the percent of the projected industry. So it'll tell you what percent of the industry is comprised of people in that occupation. So a sample output would look like this. And I know it's hard to see on the slide, but it would give you the average employment, the annual average employment for the base year, which is 2018, then 2028. We're going to produce 2020 to 2030 later this fall, give you the number change, percent change, annual growth rate, and it'll give you the percent estimated in the industry and occupation. Because again, you can use a staffing pattern to go in both directions. So I'll give you an example here. Offices of physicians. I just pulled up offices of physicians and did an estimate of who hires physicians' office. Notice what's not at the top of this list is doctors. Family and general practitioners are only 3.3% of the employment of offices of physicians. Why is that? Two reasons. Number one, the physician is often the business owner. Remember that in Texas, we don't have the corporate practice of medicine generally. So a lot of times the physician is going to be the business owner or one of the partners in the business if it's a partnership. The other reason, though, is think about who works in the doctor's office. It's not just the doctor. I mean, that's who you think about when you go to the doctor, but look at who's at the top. Medical assistants, medical secretaries, the person who checks you in, nurse practitioners. Obviously, you're going to see nurses in a doctor's office, both registered and licensed and professional. Billing and posting clerks. Think of the people in the back room that file the insurance claims when you go to the doctor. There are a lot of people that will work in a physician's office other than a physician. So sometimes looking at these staffing patterns and saying, what occupations does this industry hire? When you kind of think it through, it makes sense. But when you first see it, it's going to be counterintuitive. That's why I like offices of physicians as an example. Okay, some other helpful data products that we have that can help you understand industries of the economy. Help Wanted Online. I think help job ads. The great thing about Help Wanted Online, because it's private data, it's not subject to a lot of the privacy laws that govern public data. And because it's based on public ads, it can be sliced and diced in a lot of different ways. Now, there are issues with with our industry and occupation coding and Help Wanted Online, but there are lots of different ways. Most of you have access to a Help Wanted Online product. We have a very rudimentary one on our website, but most of you have, I think the boards have access to the Burning Glass product. There are lots of ways you can slice and dice it. Texas Labor Analysis, which is a website that we've set up, it can give you a lot of detail about super sectors. And also for those of you who've been in the workforce system a while and remember the governor's clusters, we fed some of that into Texas Labor Analysis. Unemployment claims data. I mean, remember that an unemployment claim is a subset of the unemployed. Somebody can be statistically unemployed, which means they don't have a job and are actively looking for work. And in fact, the definition of unemployment, I believe Commissioner Daniel or Chairman Daniel mentioned it yesterday. You can be statistically unemployed, but be ineligible for benefits. So remember that claims are a subset of the unemployed. And then, there are some third-party applications and industry surveys that can also help you understand a sector of the economy. If you want, you could look at our demand reports from Texas Labor Analysis. So what you would do is you go to our Texas Labor Analysis website, you'd select your workforce board area, and you can select an industry and it'll talk about demand in that industry. And I will show you it. It'll give you, there are also some regional economic profiles that we have on Texas Labor Analysis that will give you estimated wages by region. It'll give you our projected employment and wage differentials for different occupations as well. So there's a lot of information about sectors and occupations and industries that we put on Texas Labor Analysis. And we'd encourage you to explore those. You can get some information out of that as well. And just some final thoughts. In many LMI data programs, as I mentioned, there's the microscope. I use the high school microscope as the analogy because we've all been through it. Your occupational levels can be general or they can be very specific, and they have they're depending on what you're doing with the data. Sometimes one is more useful than the other. And the other thing I would say is this, data by itself is a bunch of numbers. The powerful combination is when you take your on the ground knowledge of your area and your region, you combine it with the data. Because what data can do for you is it can provide you some context and also reality check. Because sometimes we all have our own little view of the world. We see our own part of the picture, and there may be something else going on that we're not aware of. And you see the data and you're like, that's not what I expected to see. And then you'd go back and you would go back to the data, say, what is this telling me? So what I've noticed is the combination of good data on the economy combined with contacts in the community and real world knowledge of your communities. That's the powerful combination that helps us make good decisions. And again, I thank you for your interest in our labor market data. Here is our contact information. Happy to discuss things with you more individually. And I really appreciate your interest in the topic. Particularly, I know that it's late afternoon. We're right outside the restaurant, so we're competing with lunch and dinner. So I appreciate your willingness to listen to some data. And what I hope we've done is we've alerted you to some data tools and also some information about the economy that can help add some value and help add a new dimension to a lot of the great work that we do, serving businesses and serving job seekers. We're close to the appointed time, but if we have time, I'm certainly willing to take a couple of questions if people have them. And I can certainly talk with you afterward as well. Yes. If you could wait for the microphone here so that our virtual attendees can see this or hear this.
I think you mentioned it earlier, but what other training do you provide? When you went over the NAICS codes, I feel like that could be NAICS code 101 course. So what other training do you provide? Where can we find it?
Well, first, there are a lot of web resources that would deal with NAICS code specifically. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has them. The Census Bureau has a really good NAICS code site that could help you explore NAICS code. So the first answer is if you're just looking about NAICS codes, there are a lot of great web resources for you. The LMI department does do trainings for the individual boards. I was actually in Beaumont last week giving a training to Workforce Solutions Southeast Texas. So we usually, so if your workforce region has not had a training from us recently, obviously we serve the entire state, so I can't go to every single region every day. But if we haven't been to your region recently and there's interest in the local workforce board and us conducting a training there, we do conduct trainings all over the state. Sometimes we do them in conjunction with other, like for example, there was a Texas Conference for Employers in Beaumont. So we tried to do it in conjunction with the TCE so that the day before the TCE, I went to the workforce office and did a training there. We try to do that if we're out in the region for other reasons too. We can kind of have multiple purposes for that, but that is something we're absolutely willing to do. It just kind of depends on the situation in your area of the state.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. Are there other questions I can answer? Thank you. Appreciate you coming. And like I said, if you have any further questions, please feel free to our emails or in the last slide, feel free to talk to us because part of why they keep us around is to help our folks in the field better understand the economy they're working on. And so when you're calling us, that is a very important part of our mission and we're here to help you. Thanks.